Okay, what's up? This is video number 2 of my 3 Bible translation review mini-series. I previously just reviewed the King James Version. Now I'm going to talk about the English Standard Version, the ESV. This is a translation that's much newer and came into the English-speaking world in the early 2000s and has been greatly received, especially by those who are of a conservative theological position and especially by those who are Reformed. So let me give a few positive benefits to the ESV and why I like it and why it's actually the Bible that I use most of the time, almost every day, both for my reading, for my preaching, and for my writing ministry. Okay, so number one, this is a scholarly version of the Bible. This is a scholarly text. The ESV is translated from some newer discovered manuscripts than they had accessible in the days of the King James Version. A lot has been done in terms of archaeology and biblical study, scholarship of manuscripts since 1611. And so the ESV utilizes a number of new discoveries, both linguistically and in terms of manuscripts. We are still learning, after all, about the Hebrew language, and believe it or not, even the Greek language. We're still learning about it, finding nuances. And so the ESV is highly received in the scholarly world. In fact, if you go to seminary, a conservative seminary, there's a good chance you're going to be studying from the ESV, which is probably the translation preferred by most Reformed and conservative seminaries today. Secondly, the ESV is a literal translation of the Bible. Like the King James Version, it is a literal translation. It's a word for word. It emphasizes word for word faithfulness as over against thought equivalency, which some looser translations like the NIV would employ. Now, I'll just share a little personal story here. When I was doing some Greek work a few years ago, I decided to find out for myself which translation of the Bible was the best for myself. And so what I did is I got out Mark's Gospel and I actually translated it from the Greek. I went through and I compared it to several translations that were on the market at that time, including the NIV and the ESV. And what I found is when I translated the Greek of Mark, the ESV almost always matched up to my own literal translation of the Bible. So I've loved it ever since. Third, the ESV is a conservative translation. Now, what I mean by that is, like, how can a translation be conservative or liberal? Well, they're all just translations of the Bible, right? Well, no, sometimes there is, unfortunately, some political bias in the translations. For instance, the NRSV and the newer NIVs intentionally use gender-inclusive language to blur some of the distinctions that are much more clear in the Greek. So, for instance, the term adelphoi, brothers, is very often translated in the more liberal translations like brothers and sisters, or siblings, or relatives, or something like that. The word forefathers, which is a male word, is often translated as ancestors. And so in some of the newer translations, there's this gender-neutral thing going on that makes me uncomfortable, because I prefer the literal gender pronouns of the Greek and the Hebrew. And so as much as possible, the ESV tries to stay faithful to that. And that does impact the way we think theologically on matters, for instance, like ordination. Should men only be ordained, or should men and women be ordained? Well, whatever Bible you're reading, that may affect it based on how gender inclusive they render some of those terms. Okay, so it's conservative. Now, the ESV is one of those translations that is periodically updated. And so while I said that it's a strength for the King James that it's not regularly updated, we might also consider the fact that the ESV is regularly updated a strength as well. After all, if the English language changes, then wouldn't it make sense that the translation itself is updated? I'll just give you a weird one. There's a passage in the scripture that says that if two women are grinding, well, the word grinding has kind of changed nuance recently. It has to do with certain kinds of dance moves, whereas in an agrarian society, it's obvious that you're talking about a farm labor work. Okay, so whenever the English language changes, and it does, it would make sense to update some of the translations from time to time. And the ESV does that. Not all the time, but a couple times they've updated it. Next, the ESV is beautiful for reading aloud. it was designed intentionally not only for devotional purposes, but to be read aloud in church. And so there's an ecclesiastical feel that the ESV has. Very intentionally, it was rendered in a way that is beautiful and magnificent. Hopefully, like the King James Version, its great-grandfather was. And that would be the last thing I'd mention about the ESV, is it is in the family tradition of the King James Version. And so if you're a King James Version person, reading the ESV is going to sound familiar to you because it's tried to stay along the King James Version tradition. And so, there was the King James, and then there was the American Standard Version of the early 1900s, and then there was the Revised Standard Version of the mid-20th century, and the ESV is a revision of the RSV. So it is technically the great-grandchild of the King James, but it's going to sound very familiar to you. And so if you want a scholarly update that's meant to be as faithful as possible to the Greek and the Hebrew while maintaining the majesty and distinctions of the King James, and the ESV would be an excellent translation. All right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some links of some ESV Bibles that I've used and appreciated in the description of this video, so you can toggle down. I'll make some of various prices. There's some very cheap ones you can get, some study Bibles, and then maybe some higher end stuff too if you're interested in getting an ESV Bible. All right, thanks for checking in. Don't forget, part 3 of this series is coming up next, and that'll be on the new King James Version of the Bible. Thanks for checking in.